A man in torn shoes and a faded jacket sits on a wet cardboard box outside the glass doors of the largest tech company in Lagos. His beard is short and scruffy. His eyes are hollow. A security guard tosses him a coin without looking at him. The man doesn't pick it up. Instead, he reaches into his jacket and pulls out a folded envelope. Inside is a document most people spend a lifetime chasing. A PhD in computer science. Harvard University. Dated 3 years ago. He folds it back slowly. Returns it to his pocket. Looks up at the building. He has stood outside these doors 17 times this year. 17 rejections. Same doors. Same guard. Same coin. But today is different. Today, he is not here to beg for a job. Today, Dr. Emmanuel Osei has an appointment. If you're enjoying the video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Emmanuel Osei did not always smell like rain and concrete. 3 years ago, he was the brightest name in his department at Harvard. The son of a seamstress from Accra and a bus driver who worked double shifts so his boy could buy textbooks. Emmanuel had carried their sacrifice like a second spine. Straight. Unbending. He graduated top of his class. His dissertation on adaptive AI systems for low-infrastructure environments was cited by 3 international journals before he even walked across the stage. He came home to Ghana with one dream. Build technology that worked for Africa. Not imported solutions. Not borrowed ideas. Something rooted. Something real. He approached 14 companies in his first year. Sent proposals. Attended pitch meetings in his one good suit. Every room he entered, he was the smartest person at the table. Every room he left, he was told the same thing in different words. We'll be in touch. They never were. By the second year, his savings were gone. The small apartment in Accra went next. He moved in with a cousin who eventually ran out of patience. He moved in with a friend who eventually ran out of space. Then there was nowhere left to move. The streets do not break a man all at once. They do it slowly. First the comfort goes. Then the routine. Then the mirror. Emmanuel stopped looking at his reflection somewhere in the middle of year 2. Not because he was ashamed, but because the man looking back asked questions he didn't have answers to yet. But Emmanuel never stopped working. Every morning, he sat in the same public library on Kwame Mensah Avenue. He borrowed a corner chair near the window. He used the free Wi-Fi. He opened his laptop, its cracked screen held together with electrical tape, and he wrote code. Line by line. Day by day. He was building something. A platform that could deliver AI-powered educational tools to schools with no reliable electricity and no internet connection. Schools exactly like the ones he and his mother had attended. He called it Root OS. Nobody knew about it. Nobody had asked. The librarian, Mrs. Abina, a quiet woman in her 60s who wore the same green cardigan every Tuesday, was the only person who noticed him. She never asked why he always arrived at opening time and never left until closing. She simply made sure his corner chair was always available. She left a meat pie on his table every Thursday. No note. No words. He ate it slowly. Always facing the window. Always thinking about the building across town with the glass doors. Kwame Mensah did not take wrong turns. As the CEO of TechBridge Africa, the continent's fastest-growing software company, Kwame's days were scheduled in 15-minute blocks. His assistant managed his calendar like air traffic control. There was no room for detours. No space for the unexpected. But on a Tuesday morning in March, his driver took a wrong turn avoiding a flooded intersection near Kwame Mensah Avenue. That was how his black Mercedes slowed to a crawl directly outside the public library. Kwame was on a coal. He barely looked up. Then something outside the window caught the edge of his attention. He didn't know why. He looked again. A man sat alone at a table visible through the library's wide ground floor window. Thin, bearded, worn jacket, but his posture was straight as a ruler. Both hands moving across a cracked laptop with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Around him, students scrolled phones and chatted in pairs. This man existed in a completely different atmosphere. Still, locked in, unreachable. Something about it wouldn't let Kwame look away. Who works like that, he thought, in a place like that? He ended his call. 2 minutes later, against every instinct his schedule had trained into him, Kwame Mensah walked through the library doors. He didn't approach immediately. He stood near the entrance and watched. Emmanuel had not noticed him. He was deep in his screen, muttering softly to himself, cross-referencing something in a worn notebook filled margin to margin with handwriting so small it looked like stitching. Kwame walked closer. Close enough to see the screen. What he saw stopped him. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a movie. It was code. Clean, dense, architectural code of a kind Kwame had spent 20 years learning to recognize. The kind that didn't come from tutorials. The kind that came from someone who had spent years thinking about one problem from every possible angle. He leaned forward slightly and read the project title open in the browser tab. Root OS, Offline AI Education Infrastructure for Sub-Saharan Schools. Kwame straightened up slowly. Emmanuel finally sensed someone standing over him. He looked up. His eyes were calm. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Just steady. The eyes of a man who had long stopped measuring himself by who was watching. "Can I help you?" Emmanuel said quietly. Kwame pulled out the chair across from him without being invited. He sat down. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at Emmanuel. "What is this?" Kwame asked. Emmanuel closed his notebook. He had answered this question before. In boardrooms. In pitch meetings. To people who leaned forward with interest and leaned back with excuses. He almost didn't answer. But something in the way this stranger sat down. Not with pity. Not with charity. With curiosity. Genuine, unguarded curiosity. Made him open his mouth one more time. "It is a system," Emmanuel said, "that teaches children in the dark." The library was quiet around them. Mrs. Abina glanced over from the front desk. She had seen Emmanuel sit at that table for 2 years. She had never once seen anyone sit across from him. She straightened her green cardigan and said nothing. Kwame did not offer Emmanuel a job that day. He did something harder. He asked questions. For 2 hours, he pushed. Not politely. Not carefully. The way a man pushes when he is serious. When he actually needs to know if what he is looking at is real or just the beautiful wreckage of a broken dream. How does the offline sync work when the base model updates? Emmanuel answered without hesitation. What happens to data integrity when power cuts mid-session? Emmanuel turned his notebook to a page already filled with solutions to exactly that problem. He had anticipated it 14 months ago. What is your error rate on the adaptive testing module? Emmanuel pulled up a spreadsheet. Clean data. 18 months of silent testing across 3 schools in the eastern region. Schools he had visited on foot. Schools where he had sat with teachers who had never seen a working projector, let alone a software platform. He had tested Root OS on borrowed tablets with cracked screens and battery packs held together with rubber bands. The error rate was 2.3%. Kwame sat back. His lead engineer had presented a similar adaptive system to the board 6 months ago, backed by a team of 11 developers. $2 million in funding. Their error rate was 6.7%. He looked at Emmanuel. At the cracked laptop. At the worn notebook. At the jacket that had clearly spent nights outdoors. "How long have you been building this?" Kwame asked. 3 years, Emmanuel said. "Alone?" Emmanuel nodded once. Kwame leaned forward. Why didn't you just go back to Harvard? Consult internationally. You could have made good money. Emmanuel was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the street outside. At the yellow buses. At the women selling fruit in the heat. At the children weaving between traffic in uniforms 2 sizes too big. Because those children, Emmanuel said without drama, cannot wait for someone comfortable to remember them. The library felt very still. Mrs. Abina, shelving books 3 rows away, stopped moving entirely. She held a book against her chest and stared at the floor, blinking fast. Kwame studied Emmanuel for a long moment. Then he did what powerful men rarely do in the presence of someone who has nothing. He took out his business card. He placed it on the table face down. He slid it across slowly. I want my full technical team to review Root OS, Kwame said. Full evaluation. 5 days. If it holds up, we talk about what comes next. Emmanuel looked at the card. He did not pick it up immediately. He had held business cards before. He knew what they usually meant. What if it holds up and you still say no? Emmanuel asked quietly. Kwame stood. Straightened his jacket. Then I will tell you exactly why. In writing. With specifics. So you can fix it and walk into the next room better prepared than you walked into mine. He left. Emmanuel sat alone again. The library hummed around him. The afternoon light moved across his table in a long slow rectangle. He turned the business card over. Asterisk Kwame Mensah. CEO, TechBridge Africa. Asterisk. He placed it inside his notebook. Between 2 pages of code he had written at 2 a.m. on a bench outside the same library 18 months ago, because the doors had been locked and the idea couldn't wait. Mrs. Abina appeared at his shoulder. She set a meat pie on the table beside his laptop. It was not Thursday. He looked up at her. She just nodded once and walked away. The TechBridge Africa headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of the tallest building on Liberation Avenue. All glass. All light. The kind of building that made you feel small before you even walked through the doors. Emmanuel had stood outside it 17 times. On the 18th, the receptionist was expecting him. Kwame's technical team was not gentle. Kwame had not asked them to be. There were 7 of them around the conference table. Young. Sharp. Expensive laptops open. The kind of engineers who had never once wondered where their next meal was coming from and coded with that particular freedom. They went through Root OS for 6 hours. Emmanuel sat at the end of the table in his clean shirt. The only clean shirt he owned. He had washed it the night before in the bathroom of a guest house whose owner, an old man named Kofi, had given him 3 nights free after Emmanuel had fixed his billing software without being asked. The questions came fast. Emmanuel answered every one. When they tried to break the offline sync module, it held. When they stress-tested the adaptive engine with simultaneous users, it scaled cleanly. When they found one genuine vulnerability in the data compression layer, Emmanuel listened, nodded, opened his notebook, and showed them the fix he had already written 2 months ago but hadn't yet implemented. The room went quiet after that. One engineer, a young woman named Abina, same name as his librarian, glanced at her colleague and then back at Emmanuel with an expression that was no longer professional. It was something more honest than that. At the end of the 6th hour, Kwame walked in. He looked at his lead engineer. His lead engineer looked back at him and said 3 words. It is real. Kwame sat down at the head of the table. He folded his hands. He looked at Emmanuel the way men look at things they have been searching for without knowing they were searching. Emmanuel, he said, I want to offer TechBridge's full resources behind Root OS. Development team. Infrastructure. Distribution network across 11 countries. We will co-build this properly. He paused. But I need to know something first. Emmanuel waited. 3 years on the street with this in your pocket. Kwame's voice was lower now. Every door closed. Every room that turned you away. You kept building anyway. Why? What made you certain enough to keep going when everything around you said stop? The conference room was completely still. 7 engineers staring at their screens, pretending not to listen. Emmanuel looked at his hands on the table. The same hands that had typed code on a park bench at midnight. That had folded and unfolded that PhD certificate on the worst nights, just to remember it was real. That had accepted Mrs. Abina's meat pie every Thursday without words, because some kindness is too large for language. He looked up at Kwame. Because I made a promise, Emmanuel said simply. Not to an investor. Not to a board. To a girl in Kumasi who walked 4 miles every morning to sit in a classroom with no books and no light. I met her during my first field test. She was 9 years old. She watched me set up the tablet. She did not touch it. She just looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me and asked one question. He stopped. Kwame did not move. She asked, Emmanuel continued quietly, if it would still work tomorrow. If she came back tomorrow, would it still be there? He straightened in his chair. I told her yes. I told her it would be there. That it would always be there. And I have been keeping that promise every single day since. Whether anyone was watching or not. Whether any door was open or not. That girl is still walking those 4 miles. I am not stopping until she never has to wonder again. The silence in the room was the kind that follows something true. Kwame Mensah, a man who had built a company from nothing, who had sat across from presidents and investors and never once lost his composure, felt something move behind his eyes that he had not felt in a very long time. He pressed his lips together. Looked at the table. Looked back up. He extended his hand across the table. Then we build it together, Kwame said. And we make sure it is there. For all of them. Emmanuel looked at the hand. He thought about 17 rejections. About cardboard boxes in the rain. About electrical tape holding a cracked screen together. About a green cardigan and a meat pie left without a word. He reached across and shook it. The 7 engineers around the table exhaled together without realizing they were holding their breath. The first month was the hardest. Not because the work was difficult. The work was the easiest thing Emmanuel had done in 3 years. It was everything around the work that took adjustment. A desk with his name on it. A chair that did not get rained on. A salary deposited on the first of every month into an account he kept checking because he still did not fully believe it was there. Kwame gave him a small team. 4 engineers. Young. Hungry. The kind of people who stayed past midnight not because they were told to, but because the problem wouldn't let them sleep. Emmanuel recognized that feeling. He had lived inside it for 3 years alone. Now there were 4 other people living inside it with him. He did not waste a single day. Within 6 weeks, the vulnerability in the data compression layer was resolved. The adaptive engine was rebuilt from the ground up with 3 times the processing efficiency. RootOS stopped being a one-man notebook dream and started becoming something with weight. Something with architecture. Something real enough to touch. By month 3, they had a working prototype ready for field deployment. Emmanuel insisted on going himself. He took the prototype to the eastern region first. Back to the 3 schools where he had tested the earliest version on borrowed tablets with rubber band battery packs. The teachers remembered him. One woman, a teacher named Mame who had given him a plastic chair and a cup of water on his first visit and asked no questions, saw him walk through the gate and cover her mouth with both hands. You came back, she said. I told you I would, Emmanuel said. They deployed RootOS in her classroom first. 31 children. Ages 7 to 12. No reliable electricity. Intermittent internet that came and went like weather. Emmanuel sat in the back of the room and watched the platform run for the first time on proper hardware in a real classroom with real children. It did not fail once. By month 6, RootOS was live in 47 schools across 3 regions. Teachers were sending feedback that the development team read aloud in morning meetings. Children who had never interacted with educational technology were completing adaptive learning modules at rates that made Kwame's data analyst go quiet for a long time before she said anything. By month 9, the numbers had reached the kind of scale that made people outside the building start paying attention. A journalist from a Nairobi technology publication visited the office. She spent 2 days interviewing the team. When she sat down with Emmanuel, she looked at her notes and then put them face down on the table. "Can I just ask you something off the record first?" she said. Emmanuel nodded. "Where were you before this building?" she asked. Emmanuel smiled. "Outside it," he said. She published her piece 3 weeks later. The headline moved across the continent like fire across dry grass. Within 10 days, it had been picked up by 4 international outlets. Within 3 weeks, Emmanuel's inbox contained messages from education ministries in Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, and Tanzania. Kwame called him into the office on a Friday afternoon and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a partnership proposal. 11 countries. Government-backed. Full infrastructure support. Emmanuel read it slowly. Then he read it again. "This is everything," he said quietly. Kwame leaned back. "No," he said. "This is the beginning of everything." That evening Emmanuel drove for the first time in 3 years. A company car, modest, clean, nothing excessive. He drove to Kwame Nkrumah Avenue. He parked outside the library. It was 20 minutes before closing. He went inside. Mrs. Abina was at the front desk in her green cardigan. She looked up. She did not look surprised. She looked the way people look when something they quietly believed in finally arrives. Emmanuel placed a small box on the desk in front of her. Inside was a brand new laptop. No cracks. No electrical tape. She looked at it. Then at him. Then back at the desk, because she was not the kind of woman who let people see her cry if she could help it. "It is for the library," Emmanuel said. "For anyone who needs it." Mrs. Abina straightened her cardigan. She nodded once. "Thursday," she said firmly. "Meat pie is still on Thursday." Emmanuel laughed. The first full laugh in a very long time. It filled the quiet library like something that had been missing from the room for years and had finally found its way back. He sat down in his corner chair one last time. The same chair. The same window. The same view of the building across town with the glass doors. Everything else was different. The annual TechBridge Africa Innovation Summit was the most attended technology event on the continent. 2,000 seats. Every major investor, minister, and industry leader in African tech in one room. Kwame had built it from a small quarterly meeting into something that filled the largest conference center in Accra. This year was different. This year, Kwame had given the opening keynote slot to Emmanuel. Emmanuel had asked for someone else to present. 3 times. Kwame had said no. 3 times. On the 4th conversation, Kwame looked at him and said simply, "The people in that room need to see who built this. Not the company. Not the brand. You. The man. Where you came from and what you built and why. They need to see all of it." Emmanuel did not argue after that. The morning of the summit, Emmanuel stood backstage in a clean dark suit. His PhD certificate was in his inside jacket pocket. It had been there every day for 3 years on the street, and he saw no reason to stop carrying it now. Some habits are not about need. They are about memory. About honoring the version of yourself that refused to disappear. The auditorium was full. In the 3rd row sat 6 CEOs who had rejected Emmanuel's proposals in the previous 3 years. He had not planned that. Kwame had not planned it either. It was simply the nature of an industry that eventually puts everyone in the same room. Emmanuel walked onto the stage. The applause was polite at first. The name on the program was not yet famous enough for more than that. He stood at the podium and looked out at 2,000 faces and said nothing for a moment that stretched just long enough to make the room pay attention. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the folded envelope. He placed it on the podium without opening it. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady and clear, I sat outside the glass doors of a building on Liberation Avenue. A security guard threw me a coin. I did not pick it up. In my pocket was this. A PhD in computer science from Harvard University. The room was very still. I want to tell you what else was in my pocket. He paused. 47 rejections. The addresses of 14 companies who told me they would be in touch. 2 years of field test data from schools that none of you have visited. And a promise I made to a 9-year-old girl in Kumasi who wanted to know if the light would still be there tomorrow. He looked out at the room without flinching. I am standing here today not because the doors finally opened. He let the sentence breathe. I am standing here because I stopped waiting for the doors and built a window. The silence broke. Not with polite applause. With something louder and less controlled. The kind of response a room gives when it recognizes something true. From the third row, one of the CEOs who had rejected Emmanuel sat very still. His name was Daniel Osei. 52 years old. 20 years in the industry. He had received Emmanuel's proposal in year 1 and passed it to a junior associate who had sent a template rejection email within 48 hours. He was not clapping. He was looking at his hands. After the keynote, the room moved into the networking reception. Emmanuel was immediately surrounded. Ministers, investors, journalists, people who 3 years ago would have stepped over him on the pavement outside this very building now leaning forward with business cards and proposals and the particular urgent energy of people who realized they almost missed something. Emmanuel was calm through all of it. Patient. Measured. He answered every question fully. He promised nothing he could not deliver. He deflected flattery with facts. He was in the middle of a conversation with the education minister of Rwanda when a hand touched his elbow gently. He turned. It was Daniel Osei. Up close, the man looked older than he appeared from the stage. There was something heavy sitting behind his eyes. Dr. Osei, Daniel said quietly. I owe you something. Emmanuel waited. I received your proposal 3 years ago, Daniel continued. I did not read it. I passed it down and it disappeared. He stopped. If I had read it. If anyone in my office had read it properly. He shook his head slowly. What you have built should have been built inside my company. I had every resource you needed and I gave it to a template email. The reception buzzed around them. No one else was listening. Emmanuel looked at Daniel Osei. At the genuine weight the man was carrying. He understood it. Shame is a heavy thing to bring into a room full of celebration. He had 2 choices in this moment. He had imagined this moment, versions of it, on many cold nights on cardboard boxes outside buildings exactly like this one. In those imagined versions he had said sharp true things that landed like justice. But justice and wisdom are not always the same shape. Mr. Osei, Emmanuel said quietly. The rejection did not stop the work. It only meant the work stayed mine a little longer. Perhaps it needed to. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in the older man's face. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated and more honest than relief. I would like to discuss how my company can support Root-OS going forward, Daniel said. Genuinely. If you will allow it. Emmanuel nodded once. Have your team send a proposal, he said simply. I will read it myself. He turned back to the minister from Rwanda. Across the room Kwame Mensah stood near the window holding a glass of water he had not drunk. He had watched the entire exchange from a distance. He could not hear the words. He did not need to. He had seen Emmanuel's face during it. Calm. Unhurried. Completely in possession of himself. Kwame set his glass down on a passing tray. He pressed the corner of his eye once with 2 fingers. Quickly. The way men do when they are in public, and something catches them off guard. He straightened his jacket. He looked across the room at the man he had found sitting at a library window 6 months ago, thin and bearded and burning with quiet purpose, and he thought about all the rooms that had turned that man away. Their loss, Kwame thought. It was his arrival. 2 years after the summit, Root OS was running in 1,400 schools across 11 countries. 3 million children. Learning in the dark. Learning in the rain. Learning in classrooms with no electricity and no internet, and no reason to stop believing that knowledge was meant for them too. Emmanuel moved out of his corner office and into the field. Kwame stopped being surprised by this. Mrs. Abina retired from the library. Emmanuel attended her farewell. He sat in the front row. She wore a different cardigan. Blue this time. She cried once and then straightened up and did not cry again. Daniel Asante's company became Root OS's 3rd largest infrastructure partner. He visited 2 schools in the eastern region personally. He came back quieter than he left. He funded 12 more. The girl from Kumasi. The 9-year-old who had asked if the light would still be there tomorrow. Her name was Adwoa. She was 11 now. Top of her class. She wanted to be an engineer. Emmanuel visited her school on a Tuesday morning. He sat in the back of the room the way he always did. He watched her work through a module on her tablet without hesitation. Without wondering if it would disappear. After class she walked up to him. "Is it still going to be there tomorrow?" she asked. Same question. Same eyes. Emmanuel smiled. "It will always be there," he said. She nodded like she already knew and walked away. He sat alone in the empty classroom for a long time after that. Some promises are not made to be kept once. They are made to be kept every single day until the keeping becomes who you are. Never dismiss the man sitting quietly in the corner. He may be building the thing the whole room needs.